Okay, so we're going to take a look at Paul's letter to the church at Philippi, and we'll do the usual thing. We'll get an overview of the epistle, and then we'll highlight some of the themes, which we then could have a discussion about, I guess. So I'm assuming a certain knowledge of this epistle is so popular as an epistle that I think most Christians have more than a passing acquaintance with it. It's packed with verses that are often taken out and stand on their own, verses of great encouragement and comfort. So I think it's an epistle that we have quite a familiarity with. So it's one of the four prison epistles. Let's remind ourselves of them. We have Ephesians, Colossians, here's Philippians, and then we've got Philemon. And unlike Colossians and Ephesians then, Paul knows this congregation. Now we know that he'd been to Ephesus, but the actual letter, Ephesians, indicates quite clearly that Paul does not have a personal relationship with his readers. But here in this epistle, he does. And so if you look at the first chapter, you can see very clearly that Paul knows them and he's grateful for them. He's grateful for their fellowship in the gospel, verse 5 of chapter 1 until now, and he's confident of God's work among them. So this is a very intimate epistle, and we think of it in three blocks, if you like, three sections, if you want to call them that. There's a theory around today that this letter, this one letter, actually constitutes three separate letters written at different times and with different purposes put together in one. And the reason for that is these three parts are very different from each other. And so people, scholars, I guess, will say, well, how do we explain the fact that this one letter that we have consists of three parts that are very different? Well, the supposition is then that it may be three earlier letters put together in one for us. Let's take a look at these three parts then. You've got chapters 1 and 2. They seem to form a unit. They belong together. And the idea in chapter 1 and 2 is both optimism and humility. They go together. So we'll see that in a moment. Okay, so there's block 1, chapters 1 and 2. Then you have another block, a separate block, which is chapter 3. And chapter 3 is very much a outburst of passion against false teachers. And you see in chapter 3 some of the themes that we've seen in Galatians and that we've seen in Colossians. So chapter 3 seems to stand on its own. And then the third section is chapter 4. And in chapter 4, Paul's attention seems to be more on the church at Philippi. He's more kind of connecting to this one particular fellowship. So those are the three blocks, if you like, that make up this epistle. Let's take a look at each in more detail. So the first block, chapter 1 and chapter 2, what you have in chapter 1 particularly is Paul's optimism. And that's the theme of chapter 1. Paul, in spite of everything, is abounding with optimism and confidence and hope. And that is very characteristic of the first chapter. He's in prison, and yet he wants everyone to know that he is overflowing with optimism and confidence. Even though he may be facing his own death, Paul is still characterized by optimism. And if you take a look at the first chapter, what you find there are a series of optimistic statements. So the first of them is in verse 12. And if you look at verse 12 of chapter 1, I want you to know, brethren, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. And that goes into verse 13. So the first thing that Paul is optimistic about is that his imprisonment has not hindered the spread of the gospel. That in fact, the gospel is not hindered at all. And the very thing then that may be behind his imprisonment is not happening. The gospel continues to be made known. So he's optimistic. The second thing that he's optimistic about is found in verse 14 of the first chapter, and that's that Christians are bolder, or emboldened, I guess you could say, by Paul's example of suffering. So Christians seem to have found new confidence, new courage. Look at verse 14 of chapter 1. Most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So here's Paul saying, look how things are working out. The gospel isn't hindered, Christians are getting bolder. And in fact, the third reason that he gives for his optimism runs from verse 15 down to verse 18. And that's the idea that Christ is still being preached. In fact, there seems to have been an increase in the preaching of Christ, even if people's motivations may not be the best. The facts of Christ and the fact of the gospel is continuing to be preached. And it's very interesting when you look at verse 17 of chapter 1. Some are preaching out of love, that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. But in verse 16, some preach from selfish ambition, supposing to add affliction to my chains. But verse 18, what then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. Now, what's really interesting about that is that over the years, people link the preaching of Christ and the holiness of the preacher. That for preaching to be effective, for preaching to be blessed by God, the preacher has to be a holy instrument or a holy vessel. But here Paul is very clearly telling us that he's rejoicing in the fact that Christ is being preached even by those who are seeking to add to Paul's burdens. They're seeking to make more misery for Paul. Their motivation isn't great. So Paul separates the message from the messenger. And he's saying that the message itself is what matters, not the messenger. And as a minister of the gospel, I've read so many times, over so many centuries, the writings of Christian thinkers and so on, who insist on welding together the idea that your message and the messenger, you must be holy for you to have any success. Well, I think that's quite interesting, what Paul says there. So he's optimistic then also, as the chapter goes on, about two other things. He's optimistic from verse 19 down to verse 24 about his own life. He's optimistic that he won't be sentenced to death, that even if he were sentenced to death, to live is Christ, to die is gain. But he's fairly confident, he's got this optimism again, that actually his life is going to be spared, he's going to continue in ministry because it's going to be good for the churches. So there's optimism around his own life, his own continued life. And then lastly, from verse 27 down to verse 30, his optimism centers around the subject of suffering. That even suffering can be viewed optimistically. And Paul doesn't go into a great deal of detail about that. It seems to be a bit of an add-on. But if you look at verse 29, for to you it has been granted on behalf of Christ not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for his sake. He's got what's known as a positive view or an optimistic view of suffering. So that first chapter then, it's filled with what we might call these days reasons to be cheerful, or more solidly, I guess, optimistic. And then as you look at the second chapter, which is part of this first block, Paul moves from a discussion on optimism to a discussion on humility. And what he does in this chapter is he quotes a hymn. Now we're going to look at this hymn separately. The hymn, as we know and we are familiar with, runs from verse 6 down to verse 11. And Paul frames the chapter around this hymn. So the first 4 verses is an application of the hymn. If you like, he's getting in first with how he wants the Christians to behave. Then he gives them the hymn, and then he gives them even further reasons to behave. So if you like, what he does is he inserts a hymn, a bit like a sandwich. The hymn is the filling, and then the 2 pieces of bread either side of the filling are exhortations, encouragements to the church to behave in a certain way. And of course, what he wants the church to behave is with humility, following the mind of Christ. So there is Paul then bracketing the hymn with his application. And the end of the chapter, from verse 19 onwards, are examples of humility. So Timothy's an example of humility. Epaphroditus is an example of humility. And we need to just notice Epaphroditus. We'll kind of check in with him later on. Okay, so humility is the great theme of the second chapter. Put this first block together. You've got optimism and you have humility. Take a look then at the second block, and that's chapter 3. And chapter 3 is a very odd chapter because it seems to be in contrast to optimism. It seems to be in contrast to humility. Instead, what you have is fierce condemnation. You have inflammatory rhetoric. You have strong and offensive language being used by the Apostle Paul against false teachers. It begins, as you know, in verse 1 with a particular thought in mind. Finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord. So that first phrase of the first verse is in keeping with the first 2 chapters. Remember now, it's upbeat, it's optimistic, it's about humility, it's about joy. So that first phrase seems to be keeping that flow going, and then suddenly you get a whole turn of in direction. You get a change in tone. And what Paul then does is he gives vent to a lot of anger towards false teachers. And the false teachers are Jewish by the looks of things, and they're insisting again on circumcision as an initiation into the mysteries of Christ. And let me just point out the language that the Apostle Paul uses. If we look at verse 2, chapter 3, beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of the mutilation. Now, you know, that's 3 bewares on the same subject of these false teachers, but he's describing them as dogs. And he's those who, they're people who mark the flesh. They mutilate the body. And then Paul goes to discuss from verse 3 how the whole approach of these false teachers, the whole Jewish approach, is filth, it's rubbish, it's dung, it's despicable, it's offensive. He talks about that, and he's saying that the Christian is the one who then is the true child of God. And once he's sort of given vent to that, Paul seems to settle down again, and he seems to go back into his optimistic and hopeful approach to his readers. So from verse 8 down, he becomes much more reflective. He's thinking about his past, his own experience as a Pharisee, as an Israelite, as a Hebrew, as someone who was zealous. And we've seen, haven't we, just how important the word zeal is to the Apostle Paul, and how he was zealous prior to encountering Christ on the road to Damascus. And then that zeal continues afterwards in the service of Christ. He becomes much more reflective. And then you get these most famous verses about Paul's desire, and that's his desire to grow, to know Christ, to have fellowship with Christ, to know the power of Christ. And really what Paul is doing in these verses, so from verse 10 down to verse 16, Paul is doing something very interesting. He's applying to himself the praise that he has offered to the churches. So think of that prayer in Ephesians chapter 1 and chapter 3. Think of the prayer in Colossians. Paul is now saying to this church at Philippi that the way he prays for them is the same way in which he prays for himself. To know. Remember how important it was in those prayers, how the emphasis was on knowledge. And here you see Paul saying, I want to know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings. So Paul, if you like, has suddenly become much more reflective. And he's saying that what I pray for others is what I pray for myself. I'm not praying that I might be released from prison. I'm not praying for an end to my misery. I'm praying for the same things that I'm praying for you. We have one common concern. We have a common goal, and that is to know Christ. And then the sort of end of chapter 3, this second block of material, again reverts to the warnings about the false teachers. And he again goes to this passionate language and this inflamed rhetoric. Just take a look at some of the verses towards the end of chapter 3, verse 19. Whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, whose glory is in their shame, who set their mind on earthly things. There he goes again. You know, the thought of these people who are teaching circumcision, who are taking things away from Christians, who are insisting that they need more and extra. So gets his passions going that he has a final word to say about them towards the end of chapter 3. And then you get these wonderful verses to close this block of material. For our citizenship is in heaven, from which we also eagerly wait for the Saviour, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will transform your lowly body. And the idea there is that false teaching are emphasizing the body. You know, they mutilate the body. They want circumcision for the body. And Paul is saying, look, our body is lowly, but it will be transformed at the resurrection. So there's the second block of material. And then the third block, the final block of material, is chapter 4. And what you have in chapter 4 is Paul addressing the church directly. And he begins the chapter by addressing some of the issues in the church at Philippi. So if you take a look at verse 2, chapter 4, I implore Euodia and I implore Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. And I urge you also, true companion, that might even be an actual name of a person, help these women who labored with me in the gospel along with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers. So there seems to have been a measure of division in the church at Philippi, a little bit of an echo, but not to the same extent, of the situation at Corinth. But here he is, and he begins to address that. And as he's addressing it, he then includes further exhortations to the church at Philippi. So rejoice in the Lord always. He wanted to say that earlier. You have verse 5, let your gentleness be known to all men. The word gentleness there is a really unusual Greek word. Is borrowed from Greek philosophy. And in fact, in chapter 4, Paul does a fair bit of borrowing from Greek philosophy. And the word isn't really gentleness. The word is a further reflection on the hymn in chapter 2. The word is best summed up like this. You've got the rights to do so many things, but you let go of your rights for the betterment of others. So in our day and age, where there's a huge amount of conversation about rights, and you've got the right to this and the right to that, gentleness is the voluntary giving up of rights for the good of the whole. So the individual doesn't insist on the importance of being an individual. The individual surrenders his or her own individuality for the good of the whole. And that's what Paul is encouraging. Paul is never individualistic. Paul is always corporate. He's always much more interested in the community, in the body, in the church as a whole, in the congregation as a whole. That is always Paul's concern. The individual is of can I say, less of a concern to Paul. And so the individual must be willing to let go of his rights, to let go of her hurt, to let go of her distress. The individual must let go of even her or his own sense of injustice. Let go for the sake of the whole. That's what the word gentleness means. And then we saw just a week or so ago, verse 6, be anxious for nothing. I think it was Sunday night, in fact. And then you can see then, leading up to verse 9, you've got these final instructions. So chapter 4 is very much rooted in the church at Philippi, addressing their concerns. And then, as you know from previous experience, verses 10 to 20 of chapter 4 constitute the thank you. And for many people, these verses 10 to 20 are the earliest in the letter. So they constitute, if you like, letter number A, if you wish. But it's been put in to the epistle as a whole. That's what lots of people are thinking today. And I'm sure you've seen how these different blocks of material are very different. And to put them together as a whole is quite interesting. So there you go. That's the structure. Let's take a look at this hymn. So the hymn is in chapter 2, and it's verses 6 to 11. And it's an early hymn. So like the hymn we saw in Colossians, this is not Paul's hymn. It's not Paul's authorship. We don't know who. The hymn is based on John and John's account of the Last Supper. But again, let's just stop for a moment. John's Gospel, it was the last book of the Old Testament, of the New Testament to be written. John's Gospel was written a long time after this epistle to the church at Philippi. And yet this hymn is a reflection on what John records in chapter 13, which is the Last Supper, when Jesus takes off his clothes, wraps himself in a towel, and bathes the feet of his disciples. So there must have been accounts of that Thursday night circulating in the early days of the church, which gave rise to this hymn. So this hymn then is a theological reflection on the person of Christ, reflecting on that Thursday night and the washing of the disciples' feet. And the hymn falls into 6 verses. I don't mean 6 of our verses now. The hymn itself falls into 6 verses. And each verse contains 3 lines. And the way it works is the first line is the statement, and the following 2 lines are reflections. Okay, now this is in the Greek original. So 6 verses, each verse with a commanding, powerful statement about Jesus. And then you get 2 lines that reflect on that statement. Let me see if I can make it any clearer. So the first verse then is in chapter 2, and it's our verse 6, I guess. So here's the first statement. Who, being in the form of God. That's the first line in the Greek hymn. Then you get 2 statements that reflect on it. Did not regard being equal to God something to be grasped at. So who, being in the form of God, did not regard being equal with God something to be grasped at. That's your first verse. Okay. The second verse, he emptied himself. That's the first line. Then the two subsequent lines, taking the form of a slave, coming in the likeness of a human. Verse 3, being found in the likeness of a human. That's the big statement. Two little ones then. He humbled himself. He became obedient to death, even the death of the cross. Now, do you see how the hymn is structured? In the remaining three verses, you get this. Verse 4, therefore God highly exalted him. Second line, bestowed on him a name. Third line, that is above every name. Okay. Fifth verse, this is the opening statement, that at the name of Jesus. Second line, every knee should bow. Third line, those in heaven, those on the earth, and those under the earth. And then the last verse, the big opening statement, that every tongue should confess. And then the second line, that Jesus Christ is Lord. And then the final line, to the glory of God the Father. So do you see how it is? 6 verses, each with 3 lines. The first line is the great statement about the person of Christ. And then the 2 lines that run behind are reflections on that great opening, bold statement. And each verse is a reflection on the person of Christ. And as a person, what is it that he did? So as a person, he's in the form of God. As a person, he emptied himself. As a person, he was found in appearance as a human. And then you get the remaining verses. God highly exalted him. God gave him a name that every tongue should confess. So the first 3 focus on Jesus, and then the second 3 focus on what God has done. Okay, it's a very powerful, very wonderful hymn. And in the hymn, there are many, many words that we could take out to discuss. I think I just want to do one, okay? But there are many words such as being in the form of God. Okay, what does the word form mean? We had in Colossians, he is the image of the invisible God. We had image there, we've got form here. And then if you look at the next, made himself of no reputation. Go back a verse now, being the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God. Okay, what's the word robbery mean? What does the word reputation mean? Okay, these are the great words. Well, I'm going to take one word out of that for discussion in a minute or two. But the great idea of this hymn is the pre-existence of Jesus. That the human Jesus whom they would have known and heard was God. God prior to his coming in likeness. God before his appearance as a man. Okay, so it's the pre-existing deity of Jesus. That's the main theme here in this hymn. Okay, so I just want to mention Epaphroditus, and then we'll open things up for discussion. We've got Epaphroditus in chapter 2, verses 25 to 30. Now, let me just read these verses, okay? This is verse 25 in chapter 2. Yet I considered it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, fellow soldier, but your messenger, and the one who ministered to my need, since he was longing for you all, and was distressed because you had heard that he was sick. For indeed he was sick, almost unto death. But God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. Sorrow upon sorrow is borrowed from the experience of David, King David, in Samuel. Therefore I sent him the more eagerly, that when you see him again, you may rejoice, and that I may be less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such men in esteem, because for the work of Christ he came close to death, not regarding his life, to supply what was lacking in your service toward me. Now, what do we know from those verses? The church at Philippi sent Epaphroditus to Paul with the gift, or perhaps just to help him. And they sent Epaphroditus, and the church wanted Epaphroditus to stay with Paul. For as long as Paul was in prison, they wanted him to remain with Paul. Then we discover that Epaphroditus becomes homesick. And as well as becoming homesick, he becomes ill or something. And he reaches the point of death. And when Epaphroditus is at the point of death, Paul is almost about to feel overwhelmed with the number of problems that Paul is facing. Then Epaphroditus recovers, but in the meanwhile, the church back at Philippi has heard what's happened to Epaphroditus, and they must have communicated with Paul in some way. And so Epaphroditus then worries about them. So Paul's going to send him back. But the problem is, in sending him back to the church at Philippi, what will they think? Because they've sent Epaphroditus to be with Paul. So are they going to be disappointed? Are they going to be critical, either of Paul or Epaphroditus, if Epaphroditus comes back? So Paul in that last verse says, receive him. Receive him, verse 20, as one who, receive him in the Lord with gladness because of the work that he's done. Okay? Now there's Epaphroditus. As you look at chapter 4 then, and verse 18, so this is in that section now that's the thank you bit, chapters 4, verses 10 to 20. Look at verse 18. Indeed, I have all and abound. I am full, having received from my Epaphroditus the things which were sent from you, a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. The idea there is that Paul has just received. The idea in the original language is just happened. I've just received the gift that you sent by Epaphroditus, and it's a sweet-smelling savour, acceptable to God. So in that verse, he's talking about what he's just received, and then in chapter 2, he's talking about the fact that Epaphroditus has been there for a while, he got homesick, he nearly died, and he's being sent back. Interesting how we are meant to marry up those two verses. When the verse that comes later on in the epistle, verse 18 of chapter 4, talks about I just received, and then in chapter 2, it's all about how Epaphroditus is being sent back. Very interesting. Last thing, and then we finish. Come back to the hymn. So chapter 2, verses 6 through to 11. The word that I want to discuss is found in verse 6. So, Philippians 2, verse 6. Who, being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God. Now, the word is robbery, and the word in Greek is harpagmon, which can mean to be grasped, something to seize, to reach out for, that you don't yet have. How do we understand that word in the light of the whole verse? Who, being in the form of God, did not consider it something to be grasped at, equality with God, or did not consider equality with God something to be grasped after. It's hugely important because it's to do with the pre-existing nature of Christ, that he is God from everlasting. He is the pre-existent God. So what I'd like us to do is have a discussion about that. Okay, so that's the epistle to the Philippians.